Welcome to the Black History and Canadian Education panel. Before we begin, I would like to offer the land acknowledgement, even though we're on a virtual platform. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Additionally, I would like to acknowledge that this land was settled and supported very early by people of African descent, the first named African being translator Matthew da Costa by 1604, and of the ongoing and seminal contribution made by him and those that preceded and followed in Canada's development. I acknowledge the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought against their will and made to work on these lands. We must acknowledge that African Canadians were an integral part of shaping Canadian history, and our history would not be the same without them. My name is Rosemary Sadler, and I am the former president of the Ontario Black History Society, a position I held for a number of years. I am the person who worked on the formalization of February as Black History Month, building on the work of our ancestors, including Dr. Daniel G. Hill and Jean Augustine. And I'm the person who most recently was successful in seeing my efforts since 1995 helped to formalize the commemoration of August 1st as Emancipation Day, which connects to many of our speakers on this panel today. Our first panelist is Preston Chase. And Preston, William Chase, is a seventh generation African Canadian and a descendant of William Parker. Parker escaped slavery in Maryland and went on to play a key role in the Christiana riots in Pennsylvania. It was his friend and great abolitionist Frederick Douglass who convinced Parker to take refuge in Canada, although I'm not sure he needed that much convincing. Born to a single mother in the Black community of downtown Windsor, Ontario, Canada, Chase went on to become a high school teacher. He is also the family historian and a passionate advocate for greater awareness of a historic Black community that time has forgotten. It was a desire for everyone to know the story of his great uncle, Walter Perry, that led Chase to pick up a camera and begin recording the stories about him from the elders in his community. Mr. Emancipation, the Walter Perry story, is the result of 20 years of research and 5 years of production. So welcome to our panel, Preston. Do you have any opening remarks that you'd like to offer?
No, I'm just thrilled and honored to be here, and thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists. So.
Well, if I can find the rest of this, it'll be awesome. Thank you. Okay. Our next panelist is Roy Anderson, a writer, director, and producer of the award-winning films Aquantu, The Journey from 2012, on the history of the Jamaican Maroons, and Queen Nanny, Legendary Maroons Chieftainess in 2015, his sophomore film, which expands on the story of the New World's first successful freedom fighters by shedding light on one of the leading figures in that struggle, Nanny of the Maroons. Roy is a veteran movie and television stuntman and stunt coordinator. During his stellar career, he's performed stunts for Hollywood stars like Will Smith, Denzel Washington, Jamie Foxx, and Morgan Freeman, to name a few, accumulating more than 400 production credits in the process, working on such hits as Men in Black 3, The Bourne Ultimatum, and Wolf of Wall Street, as well as top-rated TV series such as Blue Bloods and Gotham. While continuing stunt work, Anderson aims to bring more underrepresented stories to the cinematic landscape through his completed docufilm on the life of famed Pan-Africanist Marcus Mosiah Garvey, that is written, directed, produced, and edited by Roy alongside Emmy Award-winning actor Keith David, who serves as the film's narrator. Selected presentations include Wellesley College Africana Studies Department and so on. Roy, do you have any opening comments that you would like to make right now?
Yeah, I'm happy to say I'm not going to be performing any stunts today.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
Right, and I'm also happy that the conversation is going to be on education. A lot of times when I'm interviewed, the first thing they want to talk about is my longstanding stunt career, and I said, listen, it's all about our history. That's what I want to talk about. And so just being among this esteemed collection here today is just an honor to be imparting whatever in my way that I can to help to advance the discussion. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Roy.
You're welcome.
Our next panelist is Patrick Kabeya. Bonjour, Patrick.
Salut.
He is a Congolese-Canadian award-winning documentary producer, currently based in Ottawa, Canada. Patrick has produced and directed several independent Congolese historical documentary feature films, as well as numerous short documentaries. With his films, Patrick has earned a reputation for developing and creating stories which mainly focus on Congolese colonial and political history and Pan-African historical figures. His 6 short documentary films have screened collectively in over 40 festivals across the globe, landing 1 Audience Choice Award for Congo, a political tragedy, and being nominated for UNESCO's Flemish Commission African Documentary of 2020 for his latest film, From Patrice to Lumumba. In the future, Mr. Kabeya plans to write and produce a Pan-African history series, which will aim to highlight Pan-African leaders such as Thomas Sankara, Steve Biko, and more. Patrick, do you have any opening comments you would like to make?
I guess Patrice Lumumba said Africa will one day write its own history. So that's why I'm here, to write our own history, try to write our own history, and very thankful to be on this panel. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Our next panelist is Dr. Andrea Davis. She is an associate professor in Black cultures of the Americas in the Department of Humanities at York University, where her research engages questions of race and gender and focuses on the literary productions of Black women and constructions of Black youth masculinities. She is also special advisor on the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies Anti-Black Racism Strategy. As a teacher activist, she founded the Black Canadian Studies Certificate and has won multiple teaching awards, including a 2020 3M National Teaching Fellowship, Canada's most prestigious recognition of excellence in educational leadership and teaching at the post-secondary level. She is a passionate advocate for Black youth, a friend of all oppressed peoples in the world, a mother, aunt, and dreamer of Black futures. She is the author of Horizon, Sea, Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critiques of Nation, soon to be released by Northwestern University Press. Andrea, do you have any comments, opening comments?
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for those really generous, that really generous introduction. I feel incredibly honored to be on this panel and to share in this conversation. And I want to take a moment in particular to thank the three filmmakers for your incredible work, for the rich narration and and curation of three formidable people in 20th century Black historical narratives, and to provide me with new text and material that I can use in my courses. I know that my students will really, really appreciate your work, as do I. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And our final panelist is Rosie Dougge-Charles. Rosie asks that people use a mix of she, they pronouns when referring to them. An example of that will be reflected in this short bio. Rosie is an educator, activist, practicing doula, and professor at Algonquin College and George Brown College. They are currently living between the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory in Ottawa, Ontario, and Lenape territory in Brooklyn, New York. Rosie is interested in racial justice and Black liberation across Turtle Island. She likes to uncover the persecutions that affect Black people's lives, like the carceral system, education, health, art, parenthood, environmental degradation, and disability. Rosie is a graduate of the University of Ottawa in Women's and Gender Studies. Rosie was born in Montreal, raised in Brooklyn, New York, and fashioned with a brief stay in her ancestral land of Haiti. Rosie, do you have any opening comments for us?
No, I am happy to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to a rich and candid conversation.
Wonderful. Well, I have one question that I'm just going to pose to each one of you in succession, and then we'll work with some general questions if that's okay. Mm-hmm. And Preston, I thought I'd start with you. What do you feel contributed the most to the success of Mr. Emancipation?
Well, a couple things. First of all, my uncle's story is just, as I've said before, it's so compelling. He was larger than life. I think he was Canada's perhaps greatest ambassador. When you got Mary McLeod Bethune to Eleanor Roosevelt making quotes on your behalf, then you know you did something special. But to put it together was relatively easy. As you know, growing up here in Canada, I had the fortunate enough experience to grow up. I can say I grew up in an all-Black neighborhood. And if I didn't like it, I just hop on the tunnel bus and go over to Detroit and stay with relatives over there. So I was good. But just the experience here, I really wanted to just, like in my own life, what I've had to experience through education. The reason because I teach, and by the way, in Ottawa, the reason why I became a teacher in the first place was just my own personal experiences I went through. So a lot of that was put into it. And then also what you go through work, it doesn't matter what type of work you're doing. There's always that added pressure we have as Blacks in particular positions. So all that was channeled into that. Like I'm dealing with work and also education, because I've always had that big question. How come actually, we all go to the same schools in elementary, we all go to the same high schools, we all go to the same colleges and universities, but when it was time to get a job, we weren't qualified or we were overqualified. So anyways, so I just wanted to make sure I put that together in a nutshell and share it with everyone.
Well, thank you for that. Let's move on to Roy. I have a question based on a quote from Garvey. He felt that Black peoples had a right to interpret their own reality and to control their own destiny. How do we contribute to African development if we're working with a Garvey approach to Pan-Africanism?
it all starts with the lens which we tell the story. Far, far, far too long, others have been telling our story, and the way they tell our stories has been mischaracterized, maligned, misrepresented, and in Garvey's case, presented as a caricature. So, it is up to us, as filmmakers, we're in a position of extreme honor and importance because we can control people's thinking, we control their minds, and the bottom line is it's important for us to tell these stories. And that's why in telling the story of Marcus Garvey, I really wanted to vindicate his legacy. And I hope that at the end of the day, that I was able to accomplish that by, telling his story.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Patrick, I have a question for you. And you actually touched on it in your opening remarks. Here's my question for you. This was another quote from him, from Patrice Lumumba. The day will come when history will speak, but it will not be the history taught in Brussels, Paris, Washington, or the United Nations. Africa will write its own history in both North and South, and it will be a history of, this one, right? Glory and
Yes.
This is a letter that he wrote to his wife.
His wife,
So where do you think that we are in that incredibly meaningful process?
Where Patrice was, I think we're still at the beginning. Because just last summer, we're across the world, across the Black world, really, or the Western world, Black people were screaming Black Lives Matter and telling the world that we actually mattered. So I think we still are, where I'm not duped to think that we passed that. So we still were where he was, which was just trying to fight for equality. I didn't think that my kids who are 10 years old today would have to, be having to go through this today, right? So I think we still backwards where we made a little progress, but not where I think we should have been, if that's the question in terms of where we are.
And I guess the other side of that question is what needs to happen?
That's a very good question, I think, right? Because I think if we had the answer, we probably wouldn't be here, right? Because I'm sure when Dr. Martin Luther King stood there and talked about his dream, and if we look at his grandkids, it's probably some of us, our generation. But yet, when they had Selma, we were still talking about Ferguson and whatnot, right? So, um, what can be done? We need to know who we are, first of all, right? We need to be proud in our history. And I think that's the main important thing for me personally. It's knowing who we are. It's such a cliche, right? Knowing who you are and where you're going. Then we need to know who we are. We need to know our history. And that way we can take pride in that and maybe move forward from there. But I don't have the answers to. I wish I did, actually, because then we wouldn't be here.
I wish I could say that I didn't agree with you, but I absolutely agree with you. I think it does start with that basis, and I'm so glad that we're part of this panel on Black history and Canadian education. Which brings me to Andrea. As an educator, you left your sabbatical to take on a term as a special advisor on the anti-Black racism strategy with York after successfully launching the Black Canadian Studies Certificate, which is phenomenal, the first of its kind, really. Scholarship can engage and connect students. But then what? What do you think?
Well, and let me sit with that for a little bit. So scholarship can engage and connect students, but then what next? In some ways, I guess I'm not in a hurry to move on to what next, because I think so much work still needs to be done at the connecting part, at the educating part, at the sharing part, at the shifting of knowledges in the university and the academy part. I think about the Black Canadian Studies certificate that it was launched in 2018. And it for some reason it made all the news. It was in all on all the major networks, and everybody thought that this was such a big achievement. And I thought, but it is 2018 and it is a certificate. Right? It seems so little, although I know how important it is. I know what labor created it. I know that students demanded it, and all of those things need to be honored. But it is such a small offering in my mind in terms of what is required and what is needed. Students are hungry from my perspective. I have the privilege of teaching a large first-year course each year with 200 students who are mostly racialized, and many of them Black and of African descent. And they are so keen, so eager to have conversations, to understand how the historical narratives that they have inherited touch and impact their lives today, and to begin to think about new ways of relating in the world, and to be able to do part of that work, part of that small work, to me, which I think is still such a small contribution, is so important. I am hoping, so the what next for me is, I am hoping every year, this is what I hope, that of my 200 students, I will dramatically, or maybe not me, maybe the text we read, the material we study, will dramatically alter the life trajectory of 20, 10, even 5 of those students, and that those 5 will leave the class and take something with them and offer that thing to the world. And that somehow over time, that will accumulate into something that will be weighty and meaningful, and that can move the arc of justice, which is what we've been saying and doing for so long, so that the work continues and doesn't end with us here.
Well, thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. Rosie, you're also in the academy, but you're approaching things from a bit of a different lens. And I'm just going to ask you how you feel about a non-gendered approach, and how do you feel that that adds to our understanding of issues specific to Black history, or the justice system, or any of our institutions?
That's a good question. Thank you so much. I think that when it comes to the gender binary, and any binary for that matter, it is part of white supremacy. And the people who like benefit the least from white supremacy are obviously Black people. And I think in a lot of ways, when we study like past liberation movements, I'm from Haiti. So when we study past liberation movements, we know that people of different genders have to come together to actually win those battles. So when I think about the idea of education and how we're going to push the needle on Black liberation, I think we need to deconstruct every notion that white supremacy has its hands in. And gender is one of them. And a lot of times when we come to discussions and talks, we see that one group of Black people are actually put at the center, and it's usually Black men. But we never talk about the contributions of Black women or Black people of different genders. There is a hero of the Haitian Revolution that I really appreciate. Her name was Sanit Belair, and she acted as if she was a man to actually fight in the army. But when they noticed that she was a woman, they executed her. But she said, "You're going to kill me as a man because I fought as a man." 33% of the people who were in the Haitian army when they were fighting the revolution were women. And we know that 1 in 3 people who were enslaved in the army were women. So that means that all women on the island were part of that. And even on a spiritual standpoint, the Haitian voodoo spirit that they called before the revolution was Erzulie, which is also a feminine energy. But that also gets erased. And I need us for us to actually center that. Because as much as I love the academy, I don't think that the revolution will come through the academy. I think it's going to come from the people. And if we're going to need to go to the grassroots of the people.
Thank you for that. I think that raising some fascinating points, and I appreciate all the discussion that we've had so far. I'm going to put out some questions for anyone to answer. These are just some general thoughts that I had based on either having viewed some of the films that you've produced, and thank you for the amazing work you've created, or because of your experience and involvement in Black studies, African Canadian history. And I guess, given where we find ourselves in 2021, what do you think is like the biggest challenge to what we're doing? Is it the history deniers, the whole thing about there's no 1619 project kind of thing? Or is it the people who are much more willing to exercise willful ignorance or white privilege? What is the biggest issue? Or what do you think?
I'll jump in for a quick second. Can you believe it that this conversation that we're having today might possibly be banned in a couple of states in the country that I live in, under the guise of critical race theory? Isn't that amazing? But we go back to that cliche phrase again about if you don't know where you're coming from, you definitely don't know where you're going. And I think that critical race theory is at the heart of studying systemic racism. Just going back to the dark pages in our history, right? And so, in a very simplistic way, I can just bring myself up as an example. As a young immigrant, landing in Canada in 1974, I'm sure everybody understands what I'm saying right now. But I came up, I finished grade 6, first of all, in Jamaica. And when I came here, they put me back to grade 6. And they also scheduled for me to go to an English as a second language class. The whole thing about streaming, which people have been up in arms about for the longest while. And I mean, I really have to applaud an organization called the Organization for the Parents of Black Children. They've been at the forefront of activism in Ontario. For example, I think they got Catcher in the Rye taken out of the studies at Oakwood Collegiate, right? And they're still pushing forward. So I think at the most basic level, our histories, our common experiences need to be taught at the most elementary level, work our way up to post-secondary tertiary education. That's really, really important. And I'm so glad that, you have esteemed educators like Dr. Davis here with us and Rosie Douglas to just help, us to shape that narrative.
And I think, Roy, thank you so much for sharing that. You're talking about things. This is an ongoing process. People have been working on having books banned previous to the Organization of Black Children. It's an ongoing process. And I think it tracks back to one of the other responses where we're basically talking about the ongoing nature that I think it was you, Patrick, that talked about we're basically in the same place that we were in 1960, and in some respects maybe we're in the same place that we were in even prior to that, even though there have been some inroads moving forward. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on this question, or we can move on.
I would,
Yeah,
Rosemary. I think I want to go back to Toni Morrison when she said the serious function of racism, it's a distraction and it keeps you from doing your work and you keep having to explain yourself over and over. I think that's key. And historically in this country, with education, Roy, I've had so many kids that actually arrived here that went through your situation. It drives me crazy. They're in special education. And And I actually, that's why I am in special education now, because I was in English and my mouth got too big. But just fighting for them inside. But I always think about, like, I mean, in my film, I always talked about this passive aggressiveness that Black Canadians have here, and we had to develop it. And it goes back to, I'm going to go back to Windsor, Ontario, which at that particular time in the 1800s had the largest Black population between Windsor and Sandwich. Okay, it was in Toronto at that time. And I think of a man that James Dunn, 1882. He wanted to actually have his daughter attend the public school because it was a better condition than the colored school, which was right next door to it. And so there were only 3 schools in Windsor, and they refused her, and then he petitioned them, and when just went on deaf ears, and he just said he took him to court because you see he owned a successful paint company and a liquor store as well, and so he had the economic power to fight. His argument with his daughter was she can't go to school because she's Black, and the board was, oh well, we don't have enough spots. And how many times have we heard that? The board ended up winning at that particular time, but in the end, the judge didn't really believe them. And then, but James Dunn went on a larger scale because he attracted media on both sides of the border. You have a Black man suing a school board in the 1800s, and he became an instant celebrity. Now, again, remember I talked about that passive aggressiveness. What he did in 1884? Well, elections came for the Board of Education. Who got on the board? He did. And what did he do when he got in? He changed things. And I really relate well with that, is because what changed my life is a vice principal in grade 11 decided to grab me and 5 other young Blacks, brought us downstairs and says, y'all gonna make $15. And we're like, oh, great, great. So where do we end up? The Windsor Police Station. We stood in the police lineup next to a guy from the neighborhood, Lonnie, who I knew really well. Okay, and we all in there behind that, just like they did in slavery. And then I remember walking out of that situation, and I looked around, I saw the projects down the street, and I just said, I'm getting out of here. And I went to the guidance, and guidance gave us that old line. I'm in the general level at that time. Oh, you're doing really well. You got 60s and you're doing really well. It's like, no, I got to do better. And it wasn't until Mr. Zavitz, as I said, I want to go to university. And Mr. Zavitz grabbed me and he goes, what's wrong? And I explained to him. And Mr. Zavitz changed my life because he said, hey, Preston, you were in my grade 11 law. Yeah. Well, you don't need a prerequisite for grade 13, so you can take your OACs. And you don't need one for accounting. He gave me a list, and then they can't refuse you. And that's exactly what it took. I know changed my life. So it's like, again, that systemic nonsense. And I think like someone that has like historical Black communities, I like to call our Black community here in Canada, the diaspora looks like a triangle because you got your Caribbean population in one corner, Africans in one corner, and then we're at the very bottom. And it's just like we need to come in the middle and actually just learn from one another and share those experiences because we're all going to go through it.
Thank you so much, Preston. One of the things about being a generational Black Canadian, I am as well, is the whole idea about the Underground Railroad and what we have been taught about what that is supposed to have meant in terms of what Canada is. And the reality, the beacon of hope and freedom, bastion, what have you. But then there's the other side of that reality. So when people, the reality is, of course, the afterlife of the transatlantic slave trade, which was systemic racism, essentially having impact on our abilities to move ahead. But when people tell you to get over it, get over Black history, or get over racism, or suggest that it's something else, how do you handle that, or what do you feel about that? I mean, are we post-racial?
I think it's actually really naive to actually believe that we're post-racial. I think I'm French. I'm from Quebec, so I was born there. So in French, there's a saying that says "Rien ne se perd, rien ne se crée, tout se transforme." So nothing is lost, nothing is created, everything is transformed, and that's from a scientist called Lavoisier. And racism is a scientific notion, like it is social science is a science. So basically, it just transforms in every other way. So we have the prison system, we have the child welfare system, we have the lack of healthcare that Black people have to face, or that Black women are in danger of. So I think that saying that we're post-racial is actually offensive. to a lot. And we can see it by last summer. But even last summer, was there a reckoning for Black people at all? Last summer was a reckoning for anyone else who thought that we were post-racial, because we been knew it was happening. And I'm 32 now, but my first real remember, like, I learned English as my third language. So I learned that, like, it happened when I first came to the US and I saw something, Amadou Diallo, die of 41 bullets. And what's really interesting about Canada specifically is that Canada's pride is that, like, they're not like the US. That is Canada's pride. And I mean, if that is the bar, it's on the floor. So when we're thinking about being post-racial, Canada as a very, very liberal country does that really well. And when I think about Black history in Canada, in the US, I'd say that America just takes jabs at history, at Black history, but in Canada, it's a scalpel. And it's really carefully cut out the parts that are actually really shameful and demonic about how they treated Black people over the centuries. So I think that saying that we're post-racial is a lack of analysis, and people need to just see how racism manifests today, because it's very alive and well. And it seems like it's less evil. So that means that it's the most effective evil.
Yeah.
Other people want to comment?
If I may,
Go ahead,
Patrick,
Andrew. No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay, so, I want to make another kind of intervention. One of the things I thought about when I was invited to this panel is the fact that in 2021, we still need panels like these that are advocating for the inclusion of something called Black history into Canada's, public school and university curricula. And the problem with, so for me, if I want to move beyond something, and this is not at all any desire for a post-racial world, but if I want to move beyond something, I would like to arrive at a time when I am beyond something called Black history. The term Black history for me suggests that the experiences and not just for me, I think this is how it's read more widely, suggests that the experiences and histories of Black peoples and people of African descent are somehow isolated from and discrete from the histories of other groups, that it stands outside of what we call Canadian or American or European history, when the reality is that the histories of Black people, especially with and after transatlantic slavery, cannot be separated from the histories of Europe and the Americas, because these histories are fundamentally about conquest, colonialism, imperialism, and violence against Africa and Africans. So naming this history as exclusively Black makes it possible for Canada to continue to narrate itself through a public history of benign citizenry like the Underground Railroad without having to really reckon with its own participation in Black and Indigenous slavery and conquest.
Andrea, I agree with you so very much. As somebody who advocated for the inclusion, the study, the preservation of African Canadian history and culture in this country for over 22 years as head of a provincial heritage organization, I was frustrated and constantly because of that reality. On one hand, knowing how important it was to push and make it happen because it wasn't going to happen otherwise. Yeah. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be something that should have to be pushed and advocated for because it is part of the story.
Absolutely.
And to offer these comments that we're forced to offer just to keep it in the narrative somehow that Black history is part of Canadian history, Black history is part of world history, like African history is, it is frustrating, but we're nevertheless put in that position. In part, is it because of our numbers? Is it because we're only just almost reaching 4% of the population in Canada now? Like, our population has doubled in the past 20 years since the time I was first started compared to the American situation. Like, what do you think accounts for that? I mean, what is it? How else can we approach this issue?
Did you want me to answer or anybody?
Well, go ahead. Yes.
I think it's just a refusal to acknowledge the deep-seated presence of Black people in this country. It's a kind of myopia. It's a refusal to see, a refusal to acknowledge, so that Blackness continues to be this surprise. But on this panel, we have two people who are multi-generational Canadians who trace their histories back over, many, many generations in this country. And people still continue to be surprised that we have been here for 300 years, that we've contributed to this thing, this place that we now call Canada, that we were, part of that founding, whatever, even we are now in a place where we might be refusing that, right? What that Canadian nationhood offers. But the fact is we've been implicated in it. We've been here. And so I really don't know. I guess that's the honest answer. What causes that kind of myopia and that refusal to see? I'd love to hear from Patrick, because
I would love to hear from Patrick, because I think that the whole idea of, the what you've been doing in terms of the story of Patrice Lumumba, I mean, what a phenomenal intellectual that he was, and how tragic he's no longer with us. But if we don't even have a sense of the diaspora, how then do we then work back to support and build Africa?
I think that's a good question, especially for Patrice Lumumba, because if you look at his whole battle, his whole fight was for unity in Africa, right? From his speech in 1958 in Accra, that's what he stood for. That's what he believed. And I think there's always been, between Black people, we probably think like, well, if we unite, then we'll be so powerful, they'll be scared of us. I think it's true, actually. I think if you look at Kwame Nkrumah, for example, with his African Union thing, which is before the European Union idea, right? And what they wanted to do. So I think there's that fear of uniting Africans. Lumumba got killed for it because he basically said, hey, Africans, we can be the masters of our own houses, right? We don't need these people or whoever to come into our house and tell us what to do. We can be the masters of our houses. So yeah. I've got a little anecdote here. Like I grew up in South Africa, actually. I lived in South Africa up until so just after Mandela became president, actually. And I remember what our white friends would tell us. Oh, but Patrick, Mandela's president now. Apartheid is done. So we couldn't talk about the past. And that was it. So basically from April 27th, 1994, that was it. You couldn't complain. You couldn't say anything anymore. And then I don't know if some people remember this, but a few years ago, there was a thing called Fees Must Fall in South Africa. So you had the kids of basically the people. I was lucky to be privileged. So basically, the maids' kids were the ones screaming fees must fall because they couldn't afford it. So then the white kids were like, you guys are always complaining. Apartheid was done 20 years ago. Move on. Right. So I think if people accept that Canadian history, we have like the Shepherd Park Museum. I remember bringing my kids to the Shepherd Park Museum and I was in tears, not because of what I saw there, but just because of things that I didn't know about Black Canadian history, right? As a Black African into Canada, I didn't know this. I was like, where do I go for this? And from there, I went backward. Chatham, London, Windsor, right? And like, who's supposed to be telling us this, right? So the school system can't tell us this because if they do tell us this, then they have to admit a lot of things, just like the Indigenous situation. If we say yes, we did this, then we have to admit a lot of our faults as human beings, as people, as a country. We're not America. Remember that, right? They're the bad ones, so we can't admit those things. I probably just veered off, so that's my answer.
Thank you. I think that we get the idea, and I think that it's we all are working with the same kind of frustration and the same kind of awareness. Roy, I wonder if you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, we're so privileged at this moment to be talking about our shared experience here as people of African descent. But if I can just offer myself up as another example again, in junior high, in grade 7, grade 8, I don't know if there was anywhere in Canada where our history, when I say our history, folks of African descent, was being taught anywhere in this country. I had to go to a place called the Harriet Tubman Center on 5 Rabina Drive at Oakwood and St. Clair. That's the only place, and it's so sad. That's the only place that I can go to speak, with like-minded individuals about our history. It is a shame. And then even now, there's pushback on both sides of the equation with the Afrocentric alternative school that just came out within the last 10 years or so. I think they have less than 200 folks enrolled there. And I mean, I applaud that effort, but I can see why on one hand, you have folks who are saying, no, we should not be focusing on Black history. We should be looking at our history. But if nobody is talking about our history, I would like to hear from our educators on here. What is the solution, to get our history included in the curriculum, in the educational system? Dr. Davis or Rosie?
Before either of you answer, I think that it's important to remember that there have been people who've been trying to have these inserts, this inclusion for decades, and I'm one of them. The Ministry of Education, there have been requests for required Black history for decades. And, something as simple as having August 1st proclaimed as Emancipation Day, while not an educational matter, but which can drive some educational discussion, took over 25 years. If we look at other communities such as First Nations and how long it has taken for their issues to become part of the narrative, part of the agenda, it's incredibly frustrating. And I think that academia is critical because they can also provide leadership, but academia is dealing with university students unless they are also informing and teaching at the people who will go on to become teachers who will also then advocate. But I would like to throw it out to Andrea and to Rosie. What do you think? How best can your positions be used to help move the inclusion of African Canadian history?
I became a professor. I didn't go to school to become a professor. I became a professor by virtue of working in the community. And by being in the community, someone at the college was like, do you want to teach? I said, okay. But, and then that's when I got my other position at George Brown. And then I learned instructional design, all these things. I just think that the answer is in community. I think the energy that we are taking to actually try to get these institutions to change can be sometimes detrimental. I have a chronic illness. I have lupus. I do not have time to do both. So my role will stay I don't have the energy to do both. And from my experience, because I was a homeschool teacher for a long time, and from my experience as a homeschool teacher, it has changed the course of the way that the kids were. Like all the kids that I've homeschooled now, they're like 15, 16 years old. They're all activists. They're all out there. One of them was one of the head who took out the SRO, so the resource officers in the schools. She was the one who did that. And that was because she had somebody who could give her direct attention and be with her at that time. And I'm not saying that everybody has the privilege to be a homeschool teacher or have time to do it, but there are people in the communities who are also educators and who could do it outside the system. And we need to give them as much value as we give these institutions value. Because as much as they are, yes, they're great, they give you theory, they give you all that, but not all Black people go to university, especially not in Canada.
Yeah.
So where are the Black people? I'm going to meet you where you're at. I am not going to stay here and wait till you come to university, because that's not everyone.
This is a great moment to just be reminding people that we have great filmmakers on this panel. And while, of course, formal education is one way to learn and develop and understand Black history, our films are another incredibly meaningful and impactful way for that to happen, in addition to the interaction that you're talking about with community.
Yes. And I want to add, like, we have filmmakers on the panel, right? How about you reach out to a school and be like, hey, do you have any Black students who are interested in filmmaking? Have them on set. Have them learn something. Yes, it's not in a classroom. They're not going to have an exam by it, but they're going to know who Patrick Lumumba is because they heard it in their ear. It's around. Unschooling is a thing. The world is a school. So take those Black people under your wing. It was a professor that told me, you're really good at teaching. And she's the one who actually brought me in to do guest lecturing. And with those guest lecturing, it gave me other opportunities. It's not because you're not a teacher that you can't do it. And then with my doula work, I'm like, hey, do you want to learn how to help people in the medical system? Come with me. Take Black kids with you at where you are. Because sometimes these institutions, they're not going to want to listen. They've been here, like there's a book called Ebony and Ivy, and it talks about racism within the academia. It has been there for years. They have like a 400-year head start. We have to have different strategies. It can't be just one.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. If I might add, I think that the shift in the academy, Roy, shift in the work that happens in the academy is absolutely critical to any anti-racist project. Because the work of the academy has far-reaching impact and effect way beyond the classrooms and way beyond even the students who ever enroll in that university. Because the university is the gatekeeper of knowledge, right? Because it gets to decide what counts as knowledge, what counts as research, and what research matters, because it gets to dictate the ways in which politicians can make decisions, administrators can make decisions, then it's really, really important to fundamentally shift the project of the academy. And for me, I see that as my fundamental role, that my presence in the university should mean that it cannot be the same as it was before I arrived. And I know that I'm not everywhere. I know that I teach in a small number of courses. I have access to a limited number of students. But I also know that my presence in the academy is extremely important and powerful, that my voice is respected and I can use it to do some things. And part of that advocacy has been working with students. And so really letting students show me what they want. So let them dictate what needs to happen and let them drive. And then I come along as someone who can negotiate those moves. And that's how we created the Black Canadian Studies certificate, which includes two compulsory courses in history, but also allows students to do courses in literature, in music, in film, in spoken word and poetry. Because for me, there are tons of courses in the university, that do other kinds of work, that do sociology work and social work and so on. But many of these courses are really they're really centering what they see as Blackness as a problem, and then trying to find solutions to Blackness as a problem. And I'm not interested in that. That's not my job. That's not the research or the work that I do. I'm interested in what Black people think, how they create, and what they contribute, right? So what happens when you bring an African lens to reading Shakespeare, or what happens when you bring an African lens to thinking about European philosophical thought? So these bastions of the humanist tradition. What moves, what has to move. That's what I'm interested. I'm interested in knowledge at its core and where it matters. And as someone in the humanities, that's what I want to do. I want to really change the terrain, and I want to insert Black thought, Black ideas, Black creativity, Black life, and Black joy into the academy. And I want my students to know the history and the violence. But and to know, Roy, I thought your film was so good at this, at unpacking all of the complexities of Black activism. So I don't want to hide anything from them. I want them to know all of that, see the picture fully and clearly, and then be able to make some decisions about how they will then move through the world.
Thank you so much for that, Andrea. We're just coming up to the end of this discussion, and one of the things that has come up, a thread that's been subtly part of this, is it's the political situation. And in Canada, we just came off of our federal election. And what I'm just going to throw out a couple of points related to that, because of course, policies will support and fund certain initiatives that make it possible for the Academy to do what it does, for filmmakers to do what they do, and so on. And I, just wonder if you have any comments about some of the Black issues that were or were not part of the federal election, or the treatment of Black leadership, or if there's any comment that you feel important to offer in terms of representation in the political sphere as it relates to Black Canadian history.
Like in the world today, we have too many politicians. We need more statesmen, because statesmen tend to get things done. So that's all I want to add.
Okay, well, thank you for that. With that, I believe that we're at time. I would like to thank each one of the panelists for their amazing contribution. I would like to thank Real World Film Festival for their ongoing efforts to bring wonderful material that we wouldn't see of a diverse nature to all of us. And I would encourage you all, in going forward, wherever you find yourselves, to support Black film and to support Black Canadian, Black diasporic, African history. Thank you all.